And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio, broadcasting here on Sauga 960 and the Big Talker 1067 FM. We are joined by Dr. Henry Miller, a physician and molecular biologist. He's also a senior fellow at the Pacific Research Institute. He's a 15-year veteran of the FDA, where he was the founding director of the agency's Office of Biotechnology. Dr. Miller, thanks so much for coming on Consumer Choice Radio.
Delighted to be with you. Thanks.
And we wanted to get you on because we've got a couple of articles that you've written. And of course, your writing profile is all across the net. There's great writing that many people have been able to read. We'll put those in the show notes for some of our listeners. But we had one that I believe is very pertinent. We're dealing with a global pandemic. We're dealing with a brand new Biden administration. And there's a lot of questions being asked about who's going to fill which position. And you have an article here about the short list for FDA commissioner. Tell us some of your thoughts on who might slide into their role, perhaps what some of the topics that they'll cover will be, and the kind of direction of public health policy going forward in the United States.
Sure. The two frontrunners for FDA commissioner, the head of the agency, at this point seem to be Dr. Janet Woodcock, a very long time civil servant at the FDA, and Dr. Joshua Sharfstein, who was briefly FDA deputy commissioner in a previous administration and is a former head of public health for the city of Baltimore. And they're both qualified by resume for heading the FDA, but both have problems, and neither is likely to preside over the kinds of reforms that are needed at this very, very important consumer safety agency. The FDA has jurisdiction over some 20 cents of every consumer dollar, ranging from foods and food additives to medical devices, drugs and vaccines, and other biological products, and even of tobacco products, such as vaping devices and pods. So very, very important job, a very important agency, but it's an agency that has had problems in recent years and even in recent decades. The agency's day-to-day evaluation and approval of products and policymaking occurs primarily at the various centers within the agency, which are pretty much autonomous. So there's the Center for Drugs, the Center for Biologics, which includes cellular products and vaccines, the Center for Medical Devices and Radiological Health. So that would include such things as diagnostic tests and stents and catheters, but also large-scale diagnostic equipment like MRI machines and CAT scanners and so on. And for historical reasons, because they produce radiation, it even includes microwave ovens, interestingly. And then there's the center that does vaping products and on and on. And again, these are largely autonomous and make regulatory decisions pretty much by themselves. And yet the agency has become extremely top-heavy. So if one looks at the organizational chart of FDA, there are a lot of boxes near the top that deal with all sorts of largely, in my opinion, largely extraneous things. So the FDA has a tendency to regulate more and more expansively. As former FDA Commissioner Frank Young used to quip, dogs bark, cows moo, and regulators regulate. And consistent with that propensity, the FDA often exceeds its congressional mandate. So regulators over the years have concocted additional criteria for marketing approval of, say, a new drug beyond the statutory requirements, which are the demonstration of safety and efficacy. And those additional requirements that FDA has concocted are such things as superiority to products that are already on the market, which is both extra statutory and also at times injurious to consumers, to patients, and also to pharmaceutical companies.
On that note of that kind of delay being having consequences for patients or consumers, one argument that I know I've certainly made here in Canada is the idea of reciprocity in approval. So establishing a precedent where a agency like Public Health Canada or the FDA would recognize by virtue of reciprocity drugs or vaccines or treatments or equipment that are already approved in countries that meet a certain standard. So whether it be the EU, Public Health England, et cetera, do you think that there's room for reform in the FDA to streamline approval processes in that way, or is there just too much resistance to that type of overhaul?
Well, that's an excellent example of the kind of reform that we need. But my answering machine is just going off. Excuse me. It's exactly the kind of institutional reform that we need, and I, with my colleagues, have written about this many times. As you say, there could and should be reciprocity of approval among what I consider the A list of regulatory agencies. Those in Canada, the UK, the European Union, Australia, and New Zealand, for example, so that an approval in by one of those regulatory agencies would then be automatically applicable to the others, with maybe a short 30-day or 60-day delay, in order that the labeling could be made consistent with each country's requirements. So, and in the U.S., that would be a particular asset, or would have been a particular asset in certain circumstances. So, for example, FDA delayed the approval of a meningitis B vaccine unduly for quite a long time after it was approved elsewhere. Possibly the most egregious example was a drug called pirfenidone, which is used to treat a lung disorder called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. It used to kill tens of thousands of Americans annually, and the FDA unnecessarily delayed approval long after it was approved in Europe, Japan, Canada, and China. And during that hiatus in approval, more than 150,000 patients died of IPF in the US, many of whom could have benefited from the drug. So that would have several advantages. It would speed approvals. It would get products into the marketplace more quickly. And also, by virtue of having more drugs approved, it would put downward pressure on drug prices, which has been a problem in the U.S. in particular.
You're listening to Consumer Choice Radio. We're speaking with Dr. Henry Miller. You can follow him on Twitter at Henry I. Miller, and we'll also link to some of his articles. Another one that we came across has to do with smarter approaches to health. It seems as if we've been in a constant conversation the past year about best practices for health. A lot of people have gotten all kinds of top-down information, but you actually put forward in this article that there are ways that people can improve their public health actually at home with something as simple as sugar-free chewing gum, not just the mask, not just avoiding indoor crowds, but actually chewing on something would make us feel better. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, the article that you're alluding to was part of an analysis of the ways that we can address the coronavirus pandemic. So there are areas of personal responsibility and shared responsibility and government intervention. And so personal responsibilities are such things as physical distancing, wearing masks, avoiding crowds in indoor venues, and so on, that we can do as individuals. And then there are shared responsibilities, such as schools or businesses having adequate ventilation in order that air is circulated and dilutes out any virus that might be present and dilutes it to a less than infectious dose. And then there are things that, of course, the government can do, such as instituting testing and contact tracing, and then the more heavy-handed interventions like lockdowns and so on. One of the unobvious, for me at least, until I began to look into this, one of the really unobvious individual interventions that seems to have promise is chewing sugar-free gum. Now, how could that be? Well, there are several ways. Chewing gum elicits saliva production, and saliva has both antiviral and antibacterial properties. And aside from the antiviral properties, because we don't know yet whether it has activity against SARS-CoV-2, it certainly has antibacterial properties, which prevents dental caries, that is, cavities. And by doing that, we reduce the incidence of gum disease and other things, which is particularly important during a time when many people have neglected regular dental checkups and dental care. So that's one way that chewing gum is beneficial. Another way is, and this is perhaps even less obvious, the lockdown imposed isolation and anxiety over the past 14 or 15 months has caused many people to be depressed. And all of this, the isolation, the anxiety, the depression, erode the body's natural immune system. And an ingenious clinical trial, controlled clinical trial that was performed some years ago found, quote, gum chewing had consistent positive effects on mood during acute laboratory stressor. The subjects who, that's end quote, the subjects who chewed gum, quote, had significant better alertness and reduced anxiety, stress, and salivary cortisol, end quote. Cortisol is a stress hormone. And also, the gum chewers, as opposed to controls, did better on multitasking tests known to evoke stress. So, in a sense, it brings new meaning to the cliche about walking and chewing gum at the same time. In other words, people who were chewing gum were better able to walk than those who were not chewing gum. So there are a lot of simple things that can be done, including chewing of gum, which is cheap and readily available, and also for many of us pleasant as well.
Oh, it's super, super interesting. I mean, who would have thought that something so simple could actually have such an impact? Now, we do have to go to commercial, but we'd love to chat with you for our next segment as well to build on that and some of the other regulatory questions if you don't mind joining us after the break.
I'd be delighted to.
And we're back on Consumer Choice Radio. We are talking with Dr. Henry Miller, a physician and molecular biologist. He's a senior fellow at the Pacific Research Institute, a 15-year veteran of the FDA, and he was the founding director of the agency's Office of Biotechnology. Dr. Miller, you just explained to our listeners how something so simple like chewing gum could provide, or chewing sugar-free gum could provide some positive health benefits. Super interesting subject. Is there anything else in your mind that is like low-hanging fruit like that you can see where maybe we wouldn't immediately think that it would have a positive health impact, but it does?
Well, the most obvious is even with vaccination progressing very aggressively in the U.S. and in parts of Europe, especially the U.K., we really need to keep pressing on the individual health-promoting interventions like physical distancing, wearing masks, avoiding crowds and indoor venues. These all add up. And for those of us who are being or have already been vaccinated, there's a temptation to throw off the yoke of these restrictions, of these interventions, which range from annoying to debilitating. The latter being not being able to see loved ones and visit the elderly and grandchildren and so on. So it's primarily continuing to do what we know works at a time when there's a temptation to give them up, to lighten the burden, and that's been particularly evident. The illustration of that has been particularly evident from the surges in cases and hospitalizations that occurred following Thanksgiving, when people got together, the Christmas, New Year's period, and now spring break. And many public health officials, including just a few days ago, the head of the CDC was actually tearful and said that she was terrified that we were going to have another surge, even as we approach the what we hope will be the end of the most severe part of the pandemic. As a result, she said, of people lightening up on discipline and celebrating at spring break.
Yeah. I mean, that's super important to stress for our listeners, is that we have to be vigilant until we do get to a point where we have vaccination rates at a level where we wouldn't see that surge, because obviously that prevents serious illness and the spread of the virus. I did want to just circle back with you quickly on the FDA and other public health bodies and the ongoing debate about AstraZeneca. Because some countries have paused the vaccination, some of the use of that vaccine, some have limited it or age restricted it, and some, like the United States, have not or have been slow to approve it. And I just wanted your take on that delay and some of the confusion, and whether or not that's creating a scenario of vaccine hesitancy.
Undoubtedly, it contributes to vaccine hesitancy, which of course is people's reluctance, sometimes widespread in certain countries, reluctance to get the vaccine. There's some confusion, though, about what constitutes delay. So, for example, some people have cited a delay in FDA's authorization for emergency use of the AstraZeneca vaccine. But to my knowledge, AstraZeneca has not yet requested FDA's authorization. And for example, another example of that was that the Wall Street Journal editorialized in December that FDA was taking too long to authorize the Moderna vaccine. The Pfizer BioNTech vaccine came first, you'll recall, and then Moderna was in the pipeline. But the journal said that FDA was taking too long. And I had a letter to the editor published in the Wall Street Journal that said, wait a minute, unless you have seen the application, with the actual application for authorization, which, by the way, runs into the hundreds of thousands of pages, you can't tell. You don't know the quality of the data. You don't know whether there were problems with the reporting of the data from the dozens of testing centers worldwide. And you certainly don't know the results of the inspections of the manufacturing facilities, which also can be spread all over the world, or even whether the inspections had yet been done by various regulatory agencies. So it's very difficult in the abstract, without knowing all of these elements of the submission and that I should say the testing, the submission, and the approval, of whether there's an undue delay or there isn't. Now, getting back to the AstraZeneca vaccine in particular, there have been a number of glitches, many of them self-inflicted by the company. AstraZeneca is a huge pharmaceutical company, but they have meager experience with vaccines. And there were some anomalies in the initial results of the clinical testing, and in fact, anomalies in the clinical trial itself. So the way that the trial was supposed to proceed was with those several weeks later, but there was a miscommunication, and some of the patients, some of the subjects in the clinical trial were given a half dose first, and then several weeks later, the full dose. And to everyone's astonishment, that those who got the half dose and then the full dose were better protected than those who got two doses of the full dose. So that was an accident, and it inspired a lack of confidence in those of us who don't expect those sorts of errors in clinical trials conducted by a major drug company. And then there was some concern about an abnormal pattern of clotting, blood clots, in those who were injected with the AstraZeneca vaccine in certain parts of Europe. That turned out to be probably a red herring. And in any case, the benefits of the AstraZeneca vaccine certainly far, far outweigh any risks, theoretical or otherwise. But some regulatory agencies, out of an abundance, perhaps an overabundance of caution, put the AstraZeneca vaccine on pause. And in Canada, the AstraZeneca vaccine alone has been restricted to people in certain age groups. So we'll see how that sorts out. But all of the vaccines are certainly safe and effective.
Yeah, and in regards to the FDA being slow, I think you raise a good point in terms of we don't really know whether, like the Wall Street Journal letter to the editor that you pointed out, maybe pokes some holes in some of the talking points. But would my kind of counter to that, would reciprocity not solve some of those hurdles or issues, or the caveat to that is, can we not use the UK as a real world example of the use of AstraZeneca and its efficacy and safety? Because that kind of seems like, at least from my point of view, it should be something whether we're talking about AstraZeneca or the other vaccines, where if it's in wide scale use and we know it's safe and another health body that is comparable to ours has approved it, I do feel like maybe there could be some time shaved off of that process to ensure that the doses we have sitting in freezers can get released and used immediately.
Well, there are nuances there. In the U.S., none of the vaccines has been approved in what might be called usual order. These are emergency use authorizations, which are not full approvals. I don't know whether in foreign regulatory agencies there have been similar kind of conditional approvals, or whether they were full approvals. But your point is well taken. And again, in general, I believe that the judgment of the other A-list regulatory agencies should suffice and get things moving, get products that are desperately needed available more widely.
We've been speaking with Dr. Henry Miller here on Consumer Choice Radio. We'll link to all of his different articles and things that we've discussed throughout our 2 segments here. I guess we're very spoiled today. So you can also follow him on Twitter at Henry I. Miller. Dr. Miller, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Delighted to be with you. I hope we'll do it again soon.
So a great interview with Dr. Henry Miller. I definitely learned a lot of different topics we discussed. Not every day we get someone formally of the FDA on the program, someone who's actually been in the nitty-gritty of that health bureaucracy and understands a bit more about what's going on, but some very good insights and practical tips. And Dr. Miller is actually very, very busy with his pen, as I mentioned, so we will link to all of his articles. Head on over to consumerchoiceradio.com. You guys can read that. Hopefully, David, you got some of your questions in. I know you had an entire pad paper full of them that you wanted to ask him.
Yeah, and can we just for a second here, how refreshing is it that you have someone who spent their life in that field and in that agency who will openly say, oh, they move way too slow, they overreach, they act beyond what they're allowed to or what they're supposed to. It is fantastic to hear people have that conversation because it's one that will ultimately save lives. Not just in the pandemic, outside of the pandemic, whether we're talking about cancer treatments or new innovative medicines. So hopefully this can be the tip of the iceberg of that much needed reform for public health agencies like the FDA, Health Canada, and comparable groups around the world.
Yeah, and there's probably going to be some reforms that are proposed in pretty much every country, because I think every single country is going to look back at the past year and say, we made a lot of mistakes. But I think those at FDA have been pretty glaringly obvious, and I think what should provide us with a good amount of room for figuring out how to reform it and how to change things. And it's great to have Dr. Henry Miller on the program. I think he gave us a lot of good nuggets, and hopefully we'll carry on with that. So, David, it's been a pleasure being on for the hour, and hope you guys stay safe. Continue listening to the program. Be sure to stream online Thursdays at 1, sauga960am.ca, also on bigtalkerfm.com. And look forward to talking to you guys again next week.
Yeah, until next week, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk soon.